So, Katja Biedenkopf, thank you very much for your presence here at the Institute as a AICGS Fellow, and compliments of DAAD. We hope that you've been able to really maximize your stay here. But of course, you've been working on a very neuralgic issue, the climate issue, the Paris Agreement, the climate talks in particular. And in looking at the American rationale, motivation involved in that, that's what you've been doing here. So I guess when I look at this now, I say, thinking about how many nations got together in Paris? How many was that altogether?
195.
195, really, first time ever. And yet, the thing that occurred to me when I was looking at all of those 195 was an old concept that was used in the European community when it was getting started, where they were saying that the way to the goal is actually the goal, that the process is more important than the product, because getting people up on one platform and moving in the same direction was as much of a task after the Second World War as anything else. And so defining the goal was perhaps less immediate than saying, at least we're on the path to that goal. Some people would say today that that's not quite enough to keep the European bicycle going. But if you translate that into this particular context of 195 nations getting together for the first time, is the bicycle still moving?
Well, it moves again, or it has moved quite, well, at a faster pace than it moved a few years ago. So I would say the way, well, the path is very important, because we've had a goal that we wanted to achieve for a long time. Already the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change sets a goal that we want to prevent climate change from causing harm to us and future generations. So the goal has been there, but we didn't know how to achieve it. And we couldn't agree on how to achieve it. And we still don't entirely agree, but we got one step further. And that process of defining, basically the process of defining a process of how we get there, that's more or less what Paris was about, because we're still not there yet, but we have a process of a 5-yearly review. We have the commitment by almost all countries that they would do something. The commitments differ very much, but we do have something. So we have something moving everywhere. So not just a few developed countries promise something, but everyone is moving. So I think in that sense, the process is very important. On the other hand, of course, we do need to achieve the goals. And what we have on the table now is not enough yet to achieve the goal. And from that point of view, I do agree with you that it is very important that we don't keep the goal out of sight. But I think Paris got us closer to it and made us realize that we're not there yet, and that we do need to invest more.
I mean, you need some benchmarks to keep motivation high. You need benchmarks to say, we've reached that milestone, now let's go to the next. It's very difficult to imagine 195 nations anywhere, even in New York on a daily basis, but on this particular issue in particular. But you had it. Let's talk a little bit about the importance, because you've been here now looking at this, of the United States in that process. How important was that?
Very important. We've seen that the process actually didn't really move very much during the time when the United States was not very active on climate change and not participating actively in the international negotiations, and then not much moved. Of course, it was not only the US's involvement or not, but it clearly is a big factor, because the United States is one of the major emitters of climate change. So if you forge an agreement without them, then you don't account for a large number of greenhouse gas emissions. But then also, of course, why would a country like China, for example, commit to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions if the US is not doing it? So you often hear this argument here that the US, we're not moving unless China and other countries also make commitments, because otherwise it's a competitive disadvantage. But you know, for the time when the US was not active, that was an argument that other countries could use as well. So it's very, very important that they are a part of the process, but of course they're not the only player.
Well, they're not the only player that would then be saying, sort of, after you, Alphonse, as often is the case in politics. but the U.S. Has an administration, at the moment at least, that was fairly committed to this, whether it's President Obama and whether it's Vice President Biden. We don't know what's going to happen in the next administration, whatever it may be. But let's talk about Germany for a minute, because if we keep that in mind, that unpredictability, what's going to happen in Washington in November of this year, knowing full well that Germany has a big stake in this by virtue of the decisions it made in, when was it, 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, and moving in the direction of alternative to fossil fuels, away from nuclear, all of those things that make Germany what it is today, and a big power at that. How important was Germany in getting Paris done?
Germany, of course, played a role, but also was part of the European Union process. So we didn't see Germany as an entity speaking in the plenary discussions, for example, because the European Union speaks on behalf of all its member states. So we didn't necessarily see it as much in the more televised or publicized activities, but it of course did play a big role. It's one of the 3 big member states that really pushed very much for this agreement to happen, that really engaged a lot in terms of diplomatic outreach through its embassies, invested a lot in, for example, the G7 summit that Germany hosted in 2015 in Schloss Elmenau. Merkel was one of the driving factors to convince the others to agree to phase out fossil fuels by 2100. So clearly Merkel as a personality itself, and you mentioned the importance of political persons who are committed. She certainly put in parts of her own political capital. So did Obama and Kerry. And that did make a role, play a role and make a change. And I think also some other German interests that you just have in the European Union politics and internationally. Germany has a large solar industry. Germany produces many technologies in the renewable energy sector and many other energy efficiency appliances or many other innovations that we need to sell elsewhere. So there's a big economic stake as well, of course.
Right.
So a driver not just for the climate and the environment sector, which is very important, of course, but also there's an economic interest.
A self-interest in this.
Yeah,
right. So let me play a game with you. Supposing we just ratchet forward and we say the current president will be replaced in January of 2017. We don't know how the next president will move forward on this. We'll wait and see. But would you, as a German, be concerned if Merkel, who's up for re-election in September 17, did not continue? Do you think you would still have the same momentum in Germany, Quad Germany, regardless of her leadership? Do you think?
So far, there's very broad support for what we call the Energiewende, the turnaround of the German energy mix. So in that area, it's not linked to her person only. Of course, there's some more skeptical and conservative personalities who I think would certainly not push for ambitious climate policy to the extent that the current government or some others would. So I think it depends very much who that new person would be. If it's someone from the established parties, and if there would be a coalition that's from the more predictable established parties, I wouldn't be too worried. If the influence by some newly rising parties becomes bigger, so that they somehow could exert some influence, then of course I would be very worried.
But fundamentally, you well know, after spending time here as well as your research in Europe, there is a majority opinion in Germany that would support going down this road, much more so than here, right? Isn't that what you found? I mean, I think that's basically the difference between the two countries. Yeah,
no, indeed. Climate change is really a divisive issue here. If you want to simplify, Republicans are against it, Democrats are in favor of it. In Germany, we don't have that so far. We have so far the CDU, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, and of course the Greens, but also the Liberals, who are in favor. What I referred to earlier as newly rising parties, we see the Alternative for Germany engaging in similar discourses as some of the Tea Party Republicans here would. So that's why I said I would be worried if this group would get too much influence, because that could potentially mean that climate policy would be slowed down.
Right. I think that basically the blowback situation we're seeing in Europe and in the United States about climate change being equated with job loss is one of the biggest challenges that are out there in terms of explaining what's at stake. But let me ask you this question. Let's say that the U.S. moves in a direction which isn't exactly as forthright or as, shall we say, as invested in the climate change issue as the current administration. Supposing there's a bit of a drop-off there. Where does Germany look for partners in terms of pushing this along to make the bike continue down the path? Who are Germany's best colleagues, allies in this besides the U.S.?
Well, one side note on the jobs. Climate policy investment in renewable energy also creates many jobs.
I'm sure.
You know, it might not necessarily be the same move. People could easily move, but nonetheless, to answer your question, first of all, the European Union, of course.
Is there enough unity in the European Union on this?
Climate change is still one of the issues where we do have quite more unity than on a number of other issues, which have become more divisive and more controversial in recent.
Like immigration?
Yes, indeed.
Right.
But also, yeah, some other policy areas. So climate is really, or has been so far, a policy issue on which the EU really could agree and also saw itself as a leader. It served to some extent also as a policy to create a European identity, to have an issue around which we all could gather and that we could really use to create a common sense of Europeanness and see ourselves as European climate leaders. Okay. So I think that for the first, as the first partner for which to which Germany would look, and then I mentioned technology earlier. Germany already cooperates a lot with China. It's not necessarily always on a high political level, although there are dialogues as well, of course. But if you really look at technical cooperation, capacity building, there's a lot of cooperation and interaction between China and Germany already. So I think to some extent on climate, I could imagine that, you know, if the US gets out of the game, that Germany would or could play a role in engaging with China even more so. Although at the moment, I think it's just a good match that the US is really very much interacting with China and that they move, you know, in tandem together. But so yeah, so I think to some extent Germany could look to China, but there were conflicts in the past as well. The the anti-dumping case, right, in which China subsidized solar panels. So there were some conflicts too. And I think at the moment Canada, of course, is also a very attractive partner, but they've also changed recently. For a long time there was not much climate action going on in Canada, but now with Justin Trudeau, that's of course also an attractive partner.
Yeah. Just let me throw another country in just for the sake of asking what you think. India.
India.
As the largest population in the world, I mean. Yeah,
but India has many challenges with regard to climate change. I think certainly engagement with India and helping India to address climate change and develop economically is very important. I don't see India becoming a leader with whom international negotiations could be pushed. Okay. So I think engagement on climate change is very important, and again, that is happening. India is very interested in investing in renewable energy, but the challenges that they are facing is really getting energy to a large part of their population that so far doesn't have access to energy, and many other problems that are,
Yeah. I mean, I think that to some extent it's interesting. It's not a part of the G7. It is a part of the G20, and so there's a lot of different ways and levels in which other countries will be engaged in this. for a myriad of different reasons. Let me close with a question about, you've been here now, it's not the first time you've been in the States, but you've been here looking at this issue. What puzzles you most about the way the U.S. looks at this issue?
Well, I would say saying the U.S. doesn't really describe anything.
Good idea.
You know, it's I've worked on California in particular, but also some other states in the past, and really there are 50 different USs if you want. So and especially in a situation in which we don't yet have a federal climate legislation, in which the Clean Power Plan is still pending, might potentially even be rejected in courts, although many people are very optimistic. So for the time being, we're still very much looking at 50 different climate policies, sometimes very committed governors, very committed legislatures, and sometimes less so. And I think that's just a puzzle of 50 pieces that is very difficult to put together. Also to know how many emission reductions the U.S. actually is already delivering, because you really have to put all these different commitments and yeah, I don't know how many laws there are in this country, many, and figuring out what the U.S. is actually already doing in the absence of some of these federal measures that are, well, now being implemented. But
well, I mean, if you were an American looking at what you just said and had some sympathy for it, which I do, then one might also then say, well, it's certainly not easy. 50 is also a pretty big number for a common denominator. 28 isn't that much simpler. But if you had to compare at the end of the day, you say the 50 states, pretty much of a hodgepodge of policy, certainly no federal policy. And in the case of Europe, you got European Union, you got 28 countries, and more if you surround them with others. To come to a common denominator there is also probably going to be equally challenging. So are we in the same spot?
we have different political systems, and I think that makes a difference. In the European Union, yes, we have 28, but these 28 member states are represented in the Council of Ministers. So they are directly involved in making the EU policy. Yeah. They're not the only ones. There's the European Parliament, the Commission plays a role, but they are a very powerful and decisive actor. So every member state actually has a say in making that EU policy. Here in the US, the two processes or the two political arenas are totally disconnected. Even senators who are meant to represent their state, they're not involved in the state policy making. And so there's no state representative really involved in making the US goals or the US policies. So I think we have much more this disconnect, which then makes it easier for states to say, no, we don't want that, we've never had our say, we do our own thing, it's much better for our own interests. So I think there you have a bit of a difference. But then of course, also for the 28 member states, it is difficult, and it has become increasingly difficult to find agreement with the economic downturn, with our climate goals also becoming more ambitious. The goals that we've set for 2030 are more difficult to achieve because we've picked the low-hanging fruits with the 2020 goals. That was much easier to achieve. We really need to transform the economy. And the way how we generate energy and various other things, the way how we consume energy. So that is much more challenging, and that of course also means that it's more challenging to find an agreement amongst 28 entities with 28 different interests. Right,
so it's sort of like playing multi-level chess, right? I mean, at the European level and in the US level, and then you multiply that in a transatlantic context. I think at the end of the day, what's good about your work here and some of the work that we support is that we are looking at all three or four of those levels. In other words, local, state, federal, and transatlantic, and trying to figure out which groups of people should be talking to each other, and I think your work will have contributed to that. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Glad to have you.
Thanks.